Matthew 27:10. As the Lord appointed me. By this clause Matthew confirms the statement, that this was not done without the providence of God, because, while they have a different object in view, they unconsciously fulfill an ancient prediction. For how could it have occurred to them to purchase a field from a potter, if the Lord had not turned their blameworthy conduct so as to carry into execution his own purpose? 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor. Though it was a shocking exhibition, and highly incompatible with the majesty of the Son of God, to be dragged before the judgment seat of a profane man, to be tried on the charge of a capital offense, as a malefactor in chains, yet we ought to remember that our salvation consists in the doctrine of the cross, which is folly to the Greeks, and an offense to the Jews. 1 Corinthians 1:23. For the Son of God chose to stand bound before an earthly judge, and there to receive sentence of death, in order that we, delivered from condemnation, may not fear to approach freely to the heavenly throne of God. If, therefore, we consider what advantage we reap from Christ having been tried before Pilate, the disgrace of so unworthy a subjection will be immediately washed away. And certainly none are offended at the condemnation of Christ, but those who are either proud hypocrites, or stupid and gross despisers of God, who are not ashamed of their own iniquity. So then, the Son of God stood, as a criminal, before a mortal man, and there permitted himself to be accused and condemned, that we may stand boldly before God. His enemies, indeed, endeavored to fasten upon him everlasting infamy, but we ought rather to look at the end to which the providence of God directs us. For if we recollect how dreadful is the judgment seat of God, and that we could never have been acquitted there, unless Christ had been pronounced to be guilty on earth, we shall never be ashamed of glorying in his chains. Again, whenever we hear that Christ stood before Pilate with a sad and dejected countenance, let us draw from it grounds of confidence, that, relying on him as our intercessor, we may come into the presence of God with joy and alacrity. To the same purpose is what immediately follows. He did not answer him a single word. Christ was silent, while the priests were pressing upon him on every hand, and it was, in order that he might open our mouth by his silence. For hence arises that distinguished privilege of which Paul speaks in such magnificent terms, Romans 8:15, that we can boldly cry, Abba, Father, to which I shall immediately refer again. Art thou the King of the Jews? Although they attempted to overwhelm Christ by many and various accusations, still it is probable that they maliciously seized on the title of king, in order to excite greater odium against him on the part of Pilate. For this reason Luke expressly represents them as saying, We have found him subverting the nation, and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he is the Christ, a king. Nothing could have been more odious than this crime to Pilate, whose greatest anxiety was to preserve the kingdom in a state of quietness. From the evangelist John we learn that he was accused on various grounds, but it is evident from the whole of the narrative that this was the chief ground of accusation. In like manner, even at the present day, Satan labors to expose the gospel to hatred or suspicion on this plea, as if Christ, by erecting his kingdom, were overturning all the governments of the world, and destroying the authority of kings and magistrates. Kings too are, for the most part, so fiercely haughty, that they reckon it impossible for Christ to reign without some diminution of their own power, and, therefore, they always listen favorably to such an accusation as that which was once brought unjustly against Christ. On this account Pilate, laying aside all the other points, attends chiefly to the sedition, because, if he had ascertained that Christ had in any way disturbed the public peace, he would gladly have condemned him without delay. This is the reason why he asks him about the kingdom. According to the three evangelists, the answer of Christ is ambiguous, but we learn from John 18:36, that Christ made an open acknowledgement of the fact which was alleged against him, but, at the same time, that he vindicated himself from all criminality by denying that he was an earthly king. But as he did not intend to take pains to vindicate himself, As is usually the case with criminals, the evangelists put down a doubtful reply, as if they had said that he did not deny that he was a king, but that he indirectly pointed out the calumny which his enemies unjustly brought against him. Matthew 27:12. He answered nothing. If it be asked why the evangelists say that Christ was silent, while we have just now heard his answer from their mouth, the reason is that he had a defense at hand, but voluntarily abstained from producing it. And, indeed, what he formerly replied about the kingdom did not arise from a desire to be acquitted, but was only intended to maintain that he was the Redeemer anciently promised, before whom every knee ought to bow. Isaiah 45:23. Pilate wondered at this patience, for Christ, by his silence, allowed his innocence to be suspected, when he might easily have refuted frivolous and unfounded calumnies. The integrity of Christ was such that the judge saw it plainly without any defense. But Pilate wished that Christ might not neglect his own cause, and might thus be acquitted without giving offense to many people. And up to this point, the integrity of Pilate is worthy of commendation, because, from a favorable regard to the innocence of Christ, he urges him to defend himself. But that we may not, like Pilate, wonder at the silence of Christ, as if it had been unreasonable, we must attend to the purpose of God, who determined that his Son whom he had appointed to be a sacrifice to atone for our sins should be condemned as guilty in our room, though in himself he was pure. Christ therefore was at that time silent, that he may now be our advocate, and by his intercession may deliver us from condemnation. He was silent, that we may boast that by his grace we are righteous. And thus was fulfilled the prediction of Isaiah 53:7, that he was led as a sheep to the slaughter. And yet he gave, at the same time, that good confession, which Paul mentions, 1 Timothy 6:12, a confession not by words, but by deeds, not that by which he consulted his own advantage, but that by which he obtained deliverance for the whole human race. Luke 23:4. And Pilate said to the chief priests and scribes, as Christ was come to bear the punishment of our sins, it was proper that he should first be condemned by the mouth of his judge, that it might afterwards be evident that he was condemned for the sake of others, and not for his own. But as Pilate, from a dread of exciting a tumult, did not venture absolutely to acquit him, he willingly availed himself of the opportunity which presented itself, of submitting him to the jurisdiction of Herod. This Herod was he who bears the surname of Antipas, to whom was left the tetrarchy of Galilee, when Archelaus was a prisoner at Vienna, and when Judea had been annexed to the province of Syria. Now though we shall shortly afterwards find Luke relating that this mark of respect pacified Herod, who had formerly been enraged against Pilate, still his design was not so much to obtain Herod's favor, as to get quit of a disagreeable affair under an honorable excuse, and thus to avoid the necessity of condemning Christ.